How many times have you thoughtfully and deliberately delivered activity instructions to your students, and this is the look that comes over your students' faces when you release them to get started? As a full inclusion teacher in a middle school ELA classroom, I found that many of my students absorb different parts of the directions, and for some of my students who have behavioral and emotional impairments, sitting and listening to directions at the beginning of class was a major trigger. My intention was for my students to feel energized and prepared when they entered a task, but mostly it just looked a lot like this. At the beginning of last year, while starting to teach the EL curriculum, I decided to use nonverbal visual symbols for each type of task or skill we would be working on. For example, a symbol for individual reading, one to analyze, and another one to work on reading response. I started including these in my PowerPoint presentations and on my objectives wall. While reviewing a student's IEP that called for a self-monitoring checklist, a light bulb went off. What if every student had access to an agenda checklist that was supported by visual symbols and cues? Just like in this cartoon, while I was planning for my student who was most at the margins, these agenda checklists were actually really helpful for all my students. So what does this agenda checklist look like? It's pretty simple. I created a template that has a column for the task, a place for students to check off when the task is completed, and a visual cue or symbol that represents what the students will be doing during the task or the materials that will be used. These checklists can be used during station rotations, for individual work, partner, or group work to keep a group on task. And one of my favorite aspects of this checklist is that I can differentiate it for different students without them knowing. Thanks to the agenda checklist, now my classroom looks more like this when I release students to get started on an independent activity. One of my highest students asked me on the first day that we used the checklist if we could have them every day because they're so helpful. Using this checklist allows me to then focus on students who need the most attention because the majority of my students are working with independence.